Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about being secure, there is this expectation of visible physical safety, like engineering, for example.
Right, visible
Yeah, you
saviors.
build a house, you put a solid deadbolt on the front door, you set up a high-tech security system, and then the contractor points to the reinforced steel and says, well, there it is, nobody's getting in, you have established a perimeter.
You have done everything society tells you to do to protect yourself and your family from external threats.
Absolutely. But then you imagine sitting in that perfectly fortified, comfortable living room. You have the heavy curtains drawn, the alarm is set, and you feel completely isolated from any danger outside. But there is a massive silent gas leak right there inside the house with you.
Oh, that is a terrifying thought.
It really is. The walls are doing a spectacular job of keeping the outside world out, but they're also locking you in with an unseen deadly threat. You feel entirely safe from the outside world, but are you truly secure?
No, you are in incredible danger.
Right. And that unseen threat is the core of our deep dive today. We are looking at a 19th century text by J.C. Ryle from his work Practical Religion, focusing specifically on his piece regarding freedom. Our mission today is to unpack this text because Ryle is speaking directly to you, the listener, about this specific illusion of safety.
He is addressing a very particular blind spot, one that is highly relevant today.
Yes, because we as a society are obsessed with our physical liberties, our civil rights, our visible security systems. But are we completely blind to the invisible chains holding our souls?
What is fascinating here is the historical angle Ryle brings to this discussion. He is addressing a British audience during the Victorian era, a group of people remarkably well acquainted with civil liberties. These were people living in what he calls the cradle of freedom.
They have quite a bit of freedom for that time period, right?
Oh, absolutely. They have a free press, a constitutional government, the right to personal property, and the ability to speak their minds without fear of arbitrary arrest. And, Ryle does not dismiss these things. He actually praises them highly.
So he is not anti-civil rights.
Not at all. But he uses their intense, almost obsessive appreciation for civil rights to challenge them. He wants them to look at a superior, spiritual emancipation. He is trying to show them a liberation that no political leader, no act of parliament, and no human legislation could ever grant.
He takes the thing they prize most, their British liberty, and uses it as a mirror to show them a massive blind spot. Before we look at the spiritual side of things, we really must first analyze what we know best, which is our physical and civil liberties.
Yes, we have to start where his audience started.
Right, and Ryle actually spends a significant amount of ink detailing his appreciation for temporal blessings. He does not take the ascetic route of pretending earthly comforts do not matter. He lists them out methodically.
He's very thorough about it.
He is. He talks about free bodies, free consciences, a free press, and free homes. He talks about living in a land where, as long as you do not hurt another person or their property, the poorest man's house is his absolute castle. You can shut your door, and the state cannot simply barge in without cause.
He sets up a stark historical contrast to make his point land with real weight. He wants his readers to realize how exceedingly rare this civil liberty has been throughout the long span of human history.
He brings up some pretty dark historical examples to do that, does he not?
He does. To do this, he points out the miseries of the Inquisition, the horrors of the transatlantic slavery system, and the crushing weight of foreign oppression. He's not just listing bad things. He is illustrating what the total absence of liberty looks like.
The Inquisition is a brutal example.
It is. When he mentions the Inquisition, he is evoking a system where even your private thoughts and religious convictions could result in torture and death. When he mentions the transatlantic slave trade, he is highlighting the absolute reduction of a human being to property, stripped of all agency.
And he names specific rulers, too.
Yes, he specifically names historical figures like Pharaoh in Egypt and Nero in Rome to illustrate the absolute devastation that occurs when civil liberty is erased. He categorizes history by looking at the individuals who impacted human freedom.
That is an interesting way to view history.
It really is. Pharaoh represents state-sanctioned, systemic slavery, where an entire people group is viewed as industrial machinery. Nero represents volatile, unpredictable tyranny where your life depends on the daily mood of an absolute dictator.
He creates a very clear dividing line in history. On one side, you have the historical champions of liberty. He lists figures like Moses, Martin Luther, George Washington, and the Puritans.
Those are heavy hitters in the freedom category.
They really are. He sees these individuals as massive benefactors to mankind because they fought for freedom in their respective spheres, whether that was physical liberation from Egypt, theological liberation from institutional overreach, or political liberation from a monarchy.
And then there's the other side of that line.
Right. On the other side, he categorizes the enemies of freedom as the absolute pests and nuisances of history. People who suppress liberty are viewed with lasting disgrace. But I have to push back here for a moment.
Okay, let us hear.
Let us unpack this. Why does a theologian spend so much ink praising civil structures? Is he just showing off his patriotism? I mean, it feels a bit strange for a religious text to spend pages applauding George Washington and the Magna Carta.
I get why you would say that, but it might seem like a tangent. But it is a highly calculated rhetorical foundation. He is acknowledging the extreme value of earthly freedom so that his later points carry significantly more weight. He knows his audience.
So he is reeling them in.
Precisely. If he started by minimizing their civil rights, they would stop reading. Instead, he agrees with them. Yes, civil liberty is phenomenal, but then he issues a dual warning about these civil rights.
What is the first part of that warning?
The first warning is about undervaluing them. He notes that people constantly grumble about minor defects in their society. He uses this brilliant analogy of new shoes that pinch.
Oh, the shoe analogy. I love this one.
It is so practical. People will buy a brand new pair of shoes, and if they rub slightly on the heel, they will complain bitterly about the discomfort. But they completely forget that having shoes at all is a massive privilege compared to the barefoot slaves of antiquity.
That puts things in perspective quickly.
It does. He warns against running eagerly after every sweeping political change, noting that changes are not always improvements. People become so agitated by the pinching shoe that they are willing to burn down the entire factory, ignoring the unprecedented safety they already possess.
So the first danger is undervaluing the freedom we have. We complain about the pinching shoes while sitting in our heavily fortified houses. But the second and far greater danger is overvaluing those civil rights.
And this brings us right back to the gas leak.
Yes, right back to the gas leak analogy. What good is living in a free country with free speech and free thought if you are held captive by unseen tyrants? Ryle asks a very pointed question. What shall it profit you to be a citizen of a free country so long as your soul is not free?
That is a staggering question.
It is. You can vote in every election. You can publish whatever you want in the newspaper. You can accumulate wealth. But if you are entirely enslaved on the inside, all those external liberties are just decorations on a prison cell.
That is the pivot point of his entire argument. He says, there are tyrants whom no eye can see, and they are just as destructive as Pharaoh or Nero. There are chains no hands can touch, and they are as heavy as any physical shackle.
Because earthly liberty has severe limitations, right?
Yes. Namely, it comes to a hard, unavoidable stop at the grave. So we must look at the superior alternative he presents. A constitution cannot protect you after your heart stops beating.
That is a harsh reality to face.
It is, but he defines true liberty not as a political status, but as a spiritual reality. And rather than keeping it vague, he breaks this down into specific facets of spiritual liberation that alter the human experience.
Let us look at the starting point Ryle identifies, which is the sheer weight of guilt. The first facet of spiritual freedom he defines is freedom from the guilt of sin. He describes the heavy burden of unforgiven transgressions that presses down on a person's conscience.
It is a massive psychological burden.
Think about the modern condition for a second. We have people lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying mistakes from 10 years ago. They carry a massive, invisible backpack of regrets, failures, and moral compromises.
Everyone has that backpack to some degree.
They do. To be free from this, according to Ryle, means looking back at old transgressions, seeing the blackest marks on your record, and knowing with absolute certainty he cannot condemn me. It is the total removal of that psychological and spiritual crushing weight.
The psychological relief of that first facet is massive, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
If that guilt is gone, it shifts the dynamic of control entirely. That leads to his next point, which is freedom from the control of sin.
This is where he gets very grounded in reality.
Yes, Ryle is highly realistic here, which makes his writing so accessible. He does not claim that a person suddenly becomes perfectly flawless or stops facing temptation. He acknowledges that the flesh will fight and the devil will tempt.
So it is not a magic wand that fixes all bad habits instantly.
No, not at all. But the defining characteristic is that sin no longer reigns or conquers. The individual is no longer a bond slave to their appetites, tempers, or lusts. The grip is broken.
That is a crucial distinction.
You might still stumble, but you are no longer locked in the basement. You have the ability to fight back, whereas before you were simply taking orders from your own worst impulses.
This leads directly into how we view the Creator. If the guilt is removed and the control is broken, the entire relationship changes. True freedom includes freedom from the slavish fear of God.
What does he mean by slavish fear?
Instead of looking at God with dread and alarm like a dreadful offended maker ready to strike you down the moment you step out of line, the perspective completely shifts. Ryle talks about the spirit of adoption.
That sounds like heavy theological jargon. Let us break that down.
Yeah, let me define that. The spirit of adoption means moving from the status of a condemned prisoner standing before a judge to the status of a legally adopted child sitting at the dinner table with a father.
That is a massive status change.
It is. You no longer want to hide from him like Adam did among the trees in the garden. You rejoice in his affection, knowing the legal anger has passed away. You stop viewing God as a warden and start seeing him as a father.
When you stop seeing God as a threat, you stop fearing society. If your relationship with the ultimate authority of the universe is secure, your relationship with human society changes drastically. That brings us to freedom from the fear of man.
This one feels extremely relevant right now.
Oh, heavily relevant. When a person is completely secure in their standing before God, it breaks the snare of caring about society's favor or frowns. Ryle points out how incredibly liberating it is to become indifferent to the shifting opinions of the crowd.
Because we live in an era where people are terrified of being canceled.
We are terrified of saying the wrong thing, of losing societal approval. But Ryle says you no longer tremble at what people might say or do because you are looking away from the visible judgments of society to the unseen favor of Christ. The crowd's opinion becomes entirely secondary.
Which brings us to the final horizon, which is death. Ryle claims that true spiritual freedom includes freedom from the fear of death. He says you can look at the grave and declare, "Thou canst not harm me."
That is a bold declaration.
You can stand by an open grave without feeling completely cast down. But hold on, I have to push back hard here. It is incredibly easy for a comfortable 19th century writer sitting in a cozy study with a cup of tea to say, "Do not fear the grave."
I see where you're going with this.
Practically speaking, how does that actually work? When a modern person gets a terminal diagnosis from their doctor, the fear is deeply physiological. It is terrifying. Does Ryle address the gritty reality of that, or is he just speaking in lofty theological ideals?
He is not dismissing the physiological reality of dying. Ryle was a pastor who stood by countless deathbeds. He knew firsthand how ugly and painful the physical process of dying could be.
So he is not sugarcoating it.
Not even a little.
Mm-hmm.
When he talks about freedom from the fear of death, he is talking about the removal of the sting. The fear he is addressing is the dread of what comes after. It is the fear of facing absolute justice with a dirty record.
That makes a lot of sense. It ties back to the guilt.
Yes, if the guilt is gone, as we discussed in the first facet, then death ceases to be an executioner dragging you to a tribunal. Instead, death is reduced to a transition. It might be a painful, terrifying transition physically, but it is no longer a penal judgment.
Here is where it gets really interesting, because when you look at all these facets together, you see the big picture.
Right, you see the whole framework.
Freedom from guilt, from the control of sin, from the slavish fear of God, from the fear of man, and from the terror of final judgment. You realize Ryle's definition is an entirely present tense reality. It drastically alters how a person operates day to day.
It fundamentally changes human operation. But this raises a massive logistical question.
Yes, the cost. Freedom is never free.
It requires a ransom. Someone has to pay for it. Great bondage requires a great price to break it. You cannot just declare a prisoner free without satisfying the demands of the law that put him in prison in the first place.
So how is this massive spiritual liberation secured?
Ryle shifts his focus to the mechanics of this liberation, pointing directly to Christ as the champion who secured it. The mechanics of substitution are laid out with absolute precision.
He does not leave any room for ambiguity here.
No, he describes a specific legal and financial transaction. He positions Christ as the divine substitute who stepped in to pay a debt. And not just pay it, but pay it 1,000 times over to ensure the account was permanently settled.
He uses terms like imputation, which we should clearly define to understand how this transaction actually worked.
Yeah, let us break down imputation.
Think of it like a massive, catastrophic financial collapse. Let us say you run a business, and through terrible mismanagement, you have accumulated $1 billion in debt. The creditors are at the door, the authorities are ready to seize everything you own, and you are facing a lifetime in a debtor's prison.
And you have zero resources.
You have exactly $0 in your bank account. Imputation is what happens when a billionaire steps into the courtroom, takes your entire ledger of debt, and transfers it onto his own account. The court legally views him as the one who owes the $1 billion.
That takes care of the debt, but it goes further.
It goes both ways. He then takes his massive, limitless wealth and transfers it into your empty bank account. The court now views you as the billionaire. That is imputation. The debt is credited to him, and his perfect credit is credited to you.
That financial analogy is a brilliant way to describe the vicarious substitutionary death of Christ. Vicarious just means acting or suffering on behalf of someone else.
It is a complete swap of standing.
Ryle asserts that Christ redeemed his people from the curse of the law by literally becoming a curse for them. He cleared the imputation of sin by becoming sin. He took the massive ledger of debt, accepted full liability for it, and then suffered the exact penalty that the law demanded.
So the law was not ignored, it was fulfilled.
Every single demand of justice was satisfied on the cross. As their champion, Christ spoiled principalities and authorities, stripping them of their legal right to accuse and making an open show of them on Calvary. The transaction was completely absolute.
So there are no loopholes for the prosecution to use later.
None at all. The justice of God was met with total finality, providing full, unquestionable redemption. The legal ledger was wiped clean.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ryle makes a very bold claim about why so many Christians struggle with their faith. He argues that ignorance of this specific transaction, this detailed legal transfer of debt and substitutionary death, is the root cause of Christians having faint hopes and ceaseless doubts.
They do not know the details of their own rescue.
He says too many people are content with a vague, blurry idea that Christ will somehow save sinners because God is generally nice. But they do not know how it works or why it is legally binding. And because they do not understand the mechanics, their faith is constantly shaking.
A vague idea is entirely useless for producing real peace. When your conscience attacked you at 3 in the morning, or when you face the brutal reality of death, a vague notion of a generic nice salvation will not hold you up.
Because the accusations of the conscience are highly detailed.
Yes, the accusations are very specific, so the remedy must be equally specific. Ryle insists that understanding the vicarious death is the absolute key to solid assurance. You must grasp that Christ stood in your exact place, suffered in your exact place, and paid your specific debts.
Once you grasp that, the fear loses its grip.
When you understand the legal finality of that transaction, the doubts begin to dissolve. You realize your freedom rests on an objective, completed historical work, not on your fluctuating subjective emotions. Your feelings might change daily, but the cleared ledger remains completely static.
And contrast the result of that permanent transaction with the earthly nations we discussed earlier. Think about those civil liberties. National freedom lasts perhaps a few centuries if a country is incredibly lucky.
Empires rise and fall constantly.
They do. Constitutions are rewritten, overthrown, or ignored. The greatest republics in history eventually crumble. But the franchise of Christ outlives the solid world itself. The privileges of this world's freedom endure only for a lifetime.
Because eventually, everyone has to face the grave.
Right. Eventually, the freest citizen on earth must submit to death, lose his voting rights, lose his property, and lose his franchise. But the spiritual franchise Ryle describes is entirely eternal. You carry it down to the grave, and it continues to live. It is a citizenship that death cannot touch.
So we know what this freedom is, and we know the extreme, infinite cost paid by the divine substitute to secure it. But there is a missing link here. How does an individual actually obtain it?
That is the practical question, is it not?
It is entirely useless to know that a massive ransom was paid if you do not know how the fruit of that ransom becomes your own personal property. $1 billion sitting in a vault does you no good if you do not have the key to access it. This is where Ryle addresses the application of redemption.
So what does this all mean for the individual listener? Ryle begins his explanation by aggressively stripping away false hopes. He explicitly rejects several methods that people instinctively rely on to feel secure.
He knocks out the props one by one.
First, he states plainly that we are not born free. Unlike the Apostle Paul, who could proudly say to a Roman commander that he was freeborn in Tarsus and therefore possessed Roman citizenship by birthright, we have no spiritual birthright.
We cannot ride on our family's coattails.
We do not inherit spiritual freedom from our parents. We are born as children of wrath, naturally enslaved to our own desires. Good breeding or growing up in a moral household does not equal spiritual freedom.
Second, he forcefully rejects the idea that we obtain this freedom simply through the ritual of baptism. He notes that myriads of people are brought to the baptismal font every single year.
And what happens to them?
They go through the ceremony, water is applied, prayers are said, yet they grow up to live as absolute slaves to vice and neglect Christ completely in their daily lives. The outward physical ritual does not automatically confer the inward spiritual reality. It is a sign, but it is not the substance itself.
And third, he rejects the idea of mere church membership as a ticket to freedom. He uses a fantastic comparison there.
He points out that earthly companies and corporations grant privileges to anyone whose name is on the registry, regardless of their personal character.
Right, if you own stock in the company, you get the dividend, even if you are a terrible person.
But Christ's kingdom is not a corporate registry that ignores personal character. You cannot claim spiritual freedom simply because your name is written to church rollbook or because you attend services every Sunday.
Let us bring back that gas leak analogy from the beginning of our deep dive. Ryle is basically saying that relying on your birth or relying on baptism or pointing to your church membership is like putting a fresh coat of paint on the walls of that house with the gas leak.
That is a great way to look at it.
It might look much nicer to the neighbors, and it might make you feel productive, but the invisible, lethal threat on the inside remains entirely untouched. The paint does not stop the poison.
Having stripped away those false assurances, the fresh paint, so to speak, he points to the single solitary path of acquisition, which is simple faith. He insists that no complicated theology is required to obtain this freedom.
You do not need a master's degree in divinity.
You do not need to understand Greek and Hebrew. It is obtained by receiving, trusting, and reposing your whole weight on Christ as a Savior. Let me explain that idea of reposing your weight.
Please do. That is a great phrase.
Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff, and there is a massive solid iron bridge spanning the chasm. You can know all about the metallurgy of the bridge, you can agree that it was built by a genius engineer, but you do not experience the safety of the bridge until you actually step onto it and let it hold your weight.
You have to actually walk on it.
That is simple faith. It is stepping onto the work of Christ and trusting it to hold you. That simple act of trust is what makes the spiritual liberty your own personal property.
The extreme accessibility of this is striking. It is almost offensive to human pride because we want to earn it. Ryle gives these vivid, beautiful examples to show just how accessible it is to anyone, regardless of their background.
He paints a very clear picture of this accessibility.
He says a visitor can go to the poorest cottager in the land, someone who cannot read a single word, who cannot repeat a doctrinal creed, who knows absolutely nothing of high theology or church history. And the visitor can boldly promise full liberation upon the single condition of trusting Christ. The intellectual barrier to entry is zero.
He applies the same logic to the dying, which is perhaps the most extreme test of his theology. You can stand by the bed of a dying sinner, someone who has wasted their entire life in rebellion, someone who has burned every bridge and ruined every relationship.
The person who has no time left to fix things.
Yes, when death is drawing near, when they have no time left to do any good works or fix their mistakes, you can lovingly tell them there is still hope. You can assure them that Christ has done all, paid all, and performed all that is legally necessary.
Even at the very end.
Even at the final hour, with their last breath, they can be freed at once from all their accumulated guilt if they will only believe and repose their weight on that bridge. The extreme simplicity of the offer is what makes it so brilliant and so robust. It works in the study of a scholar, and it works in the gutter.
This leads right into his highly practical advice for the listener today. Ryle urges people to stop wasting time speculating on invisible decrees. People get tied up in terrible theological knots wondering, am I part of the elect?
It is a common source of anxiety.
Am I a chosen vessel of grace? Did Christ actually die for me specifically, or am I excluded by some divine decree made before time began? Ryle says those questions are completely unprofitable starting points.
You cannot read the hidden ledger of heaven.
You should not pore over secret things you cannot see. Instead, he says to settle your thoughts on one very simple, immediate inquiry. Do I believe? Do I cast myself on him as a humble sinner? That is the only question that matters. If the answer is yes, then all the secret decrees of heaven are demonstrably in your favor.
Moving from the individual application to the brighter society, we have to look at the present-day reality surrounding us. If the offer of complete, eternal freedom is so incredibly accessible, just simple faith, why do so many reject it?
And what should the people who have been liberated do about the world around them?
Ryle delivers a very harsh, unsparing critique of modern society regarding this exact issue. He looks at a society that prides itself on being enlightened and sees utter delusion.
He highlights the terrifying reality of invisible slavery. People boast endlessly of their liberty. They talk constantly about political freedom, free trade, the right to protest, and freedom of speech.
But what is happening behind the scenes?
Yet, while they are shouting about their rights in the public square, they are bound hand and foot by lust, ambition, the love of money, gambling, or an uncontrollable temper. They are entirely governed by these unseen masters.
Ryle says they go down to destruction with a lie in their right hand.
They firmly believe they are autonomous, free individuals while operating as thorough slaves to their own internal corruption.
The modern psychology of addiction and ambitions perfectly mirrors the slavery Ryle describes. Think about a person obsessed with accumulating money, or someone driven by a furious, reactive temper. They are not actually in control of their own actions.
They are reacting to an internal drive.
They are compelled by a force outside their rational will. They will destroy their marriages, alienate their children, and ruin their health to serve these invisible masters. Yet, because no one has placed physical iron handcuffs on their wrists, they proudly proclaim their independence.
Recognizing this invisible psychological and spiritual slavery leads directly to Ryle's call to action for those who are actually free. It is a highly challenging, uncomfortable question for anyone who claims to hold this spiritual freedom.
He does not let the comfortable reader off the hook.
If politicians labor night and day for free trade agreements, and activists spend their entire lives fighting for civil rights and temporal freedoms that will end at the grave, how can those who hold the secret to eternal spiritual freedom do nothing? How can they sit back in silence while the house fills with gas?
Ryle outlines a clear, urgent mandate to share this message. And to understand his call to action, we have to look objectively through his 19th century Protestant lens. For Ryle, global evangelism was not just a polite suggestion.
It was an absolute necessity for him.
It was an urgent rescue mission aimed at anyone outside his theological framework. Maintaining an objective look at its historical context, Ryle specifically targets several groups for evangelism. He calls for Christians to bring this message of freedom to the unreached populations across the globe.
And he had a few other specific groups in mind, right?
He did. He pointed to the scattered Jewish communities who have not recognized the Messiah, and to those he views as captive under the institutional system of the Roman Catholic Church. For a 19th century English Protestant like Ryle, these groups represented people trapped in varying degrees of theological or spiritual bondage.
We are just reporting his historical arguments here, but that was a major part of his worldview.
It is a sweeping call to prioritize spiritual emancipation with the exact same zeal, or even greater zeal, than the secular world applies to political emancipation.
And as we apply this reality to our present lives, there is an unavoidable, painful tension that we have to address. Ryle admits that believers, even those who have stepped onto the bridge of simple faith and secured this massive liberation, still face a harsh reality.
It is not a walk in the park.
They still shed tears. They still have weak, failing hearts. They still face intense daily temptation, chronic physical sickness, financial ruin, and betrayal. If we are completely legally free and the debt is paid, why does life still hurt so incredibly much? Why does the house still feel like it is falling apart?
He introduces this eschatological hope to answer that tension. Eschatological hope is a theological term that basically means the ultimate endgame resolution of the universe, where all this temporary suffering finally makes sense and is permanently resolved.
How does he frame that tension in the text?
He addresses the tension of living in the present, broken world by using a brilliant analogy. He says our redemption has begun, the legal paperwork is signed, but the physical reality is not yet completed. He states, we have redemption now in the root, but we have it not in the flower.
That is a fascinating way to phrase it, because the root versus the flower analogy perfectly captures the human experience. Let us really look at how a plant grows. The root of a plant is hidden completely under the dirt.
It is not pretty to look at.
It is dirty, it is obscured, it is covered in mud. It does not look beautiful, colorful, or glorious in any way. But that ugly root contains the absolute guarantee of life. It holds the complete DNA of the eventual spectacular blossom.
That is the guarantee he is talking about.
Right now, living in this broken world, believers have the root. The legal transaction is done. The imputation of righteousness is complete. The freedom from the eternal guilt of sin is totally secure. But we are still surrounded by dirt.
We are still in the mud.
We are still waiting for the flower to bloom. We are still waiting to see the visible, glorious manifestation of that freedom where the physical pain, the mental illness, and the grief are actually finally gone.
He concludes his entire analysis by anticipating what he calls the Great Jubilee. He looks forward to the eschatological horizon, the second coming of Christ. He says that when that cataclysmic event happens, the physical reality will finally catch up to the legal reality.
The root finally breaks the surface.
Yes, the dead will be raised, the living will be changed, and then, and not till then, we shall be completely free in every possible sense of the word. The liberty which we enjoyed by faith, trusting the unseen ledger, will be changed into the undeniable liberty of sight.
So the waiting finally ends.
The freedom of hope will become the freedom of absolute certainty. The dirty, obscured root will finally burst into the magnificent eternal flower. All the promises will materialize into physical reality.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over today as you go back to your daily routine. Think about Ryle's concept of having redemption in the root, but not in the flower.
It is a perspective shift.
When you look at the lingering anxieties that keep you up at night, the bad habits you have to fight against every single day, or the chronic physical pains in your own life, how does viewing them as temporary conditions change the way you face tomorrow's challenges?
It changes how you handle the dirt.
It really does. It means the pain is not the end of the story. It is just the soil where the seed is planted. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take some time this week to examine your own unseen chains, check the house for invisible threats, and ask yourself where your true, lasting freedom actually lies.